Hey, welcome to my second series of lectures. This one slightly related to the first, but it really is a separate issue. I'm going to talk in this series about how to analyze and critique gameplay in a way that's effective and useful for you as a designer. There are a lot of ways to critique gameplay, really, but most of them are pretty meaningless if your goal is to improve as a designer. There are a lot of ways to look at games and talk about them, but most of them come down to I liked the game versus I didn't like the game. And you might think that's because game design is subjective, but it's not. It's only subjective if you let it be. You can impose objectivity on design, and this lecture series is going to be all about how to do that in the analysis of existing gameplay, which could absolutely apply to games that you're making or a game that's been out for a million years. It doesn't matter. But first, I want to talk about what is the purpose of design critique? What function does it serve? And in my estimation, there are four main reasons that a designer will want to engage in design analysis. It's help solving design problems, practicing constructive hypotheses, practicing reverse engineering design process, and finally, getting a better understanding of how design relates to itself in terms of all the different parts of a gameplay, in terms like experience versus behavior versus mechanics and how those all relate together. So the first one is getting help solving specific design problems. That's really obviously useful because if you're stuck somewhere, you can often get an answer from somewhere else and then tweak it a little bit. But you can't do that unless you really understand the design that you're taking from something else. I don't want to use the word stealing because it's not really stealing. You're there's just a ready-made solution, right? It's like I don't wake up every day and then have to learn how to make fire and then invent everything on my own. There's people who've already done all that. So I just use it, right? Why would I start from absolute scratch? So it's not stealing, just take the ideas. It's fine. Just not too many of them for one thing. That's a bad idea. But the first one is getting help solving specific design problems. And that's probably useful for obvious reasons, but once you've gotten good at a design process, you should be pretty good at framing design problems that you've run into or that you anticipate running into in your own product, in your own projects. Once you've done that, then gameplay analysis, you can start slotting in solutions because you not only understand the problem that you're having to a very specific and precise degree, but you also understand the design that you're applying in order to solve that problem, and you have an expected outcome from that mashup. All very important things to have. Excellent. The second one was practicing constructing hypotheses, objective hypotheses. This is important because, just like anything else, first of all, it's a skill and you need to work on it to improve it. That's important. But also, thinking about it like a hypothesis really is the way to go. And in the scientific method, it's generally like you observe and you build a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis. I understand that's a massive oversimplification, but that basic process is really valuable. And I absolutely implore people to apply that in their gameplay design analysis. More on exactly how to do that later. The third thing is practicing reverse engineering designs, which basically means if design is all about process, then understanding what kind of process will output what kind of creative work is really important because there is process in design, whether you're aware of it or not. So it makes sense to be aware of it so that you can control it. Because if you're not aware of it, there is a process that's taking place. You just don't know about it. It's a tacit process. And then something happens and you don't know why and you can't control the outcome and you can't solve any of the problems. That's really a big issue in terms of procedure and process. So knowing how to build what you want to build by applying a certain process, super crucial, very foundational design element. And gameplay analysis can help you look at that relationship from the perspective of already knowing the outcome, because you can play a game that exists and say, well, here's the outcome because this is the final product. So how could you have gotten here via some process? The fourth one is connecting design. So you have player experience at the top, and then beneath that you have player behavior and player decisions. And then beneath that you have everything else, mechanics, systems, all that. And understanding how all of those things work together is really, really crucial to being able to evaluate design. And again, you're practicing doing that with gameplay analysis. But also, you're seeing how designs can work in a way that you're probably not used to, because different human beings are going to have different ways of approaching it. So you get a very unique perspective, and you can see, oh, I see what they did here. Okay, this is all right. So this connects this way, and that makes the players feel like this because it makes them have to decide this in this context, right? That's the kind of way you want to be thinking about analysis, and it does help you understand the foundational relationship between mechanics and behavior and decisions and experience. So those are the four main things that I think good analysis offers to a designer, the value that it has for you as a designer. And the second thing I want to talk about here is the mindset that you should be using, that you should be in when you start doing gameplay analysis. First, make sure you're thinking clearly and objectively. And I know that's sort of an abstract thing to say, but really what I mean by that is make sure you could say something like, how would I know? So if you make a statement about a game, like any statement, just make any statement about any game, then take your statement and immediately ask yourself about that statement, how would I know if that's true? How would I know if it's wrong? If you ask those questions and you can answer them, and I mean really answer them, and I don't mean like, well, I would just know, I would play the game and then I would know. No. Not objective at all. In fact, that's pretty much as subjective as you can get. Don't do that. We're employing the objective method here, which means we have to be ever vigilant against subjectivity, because it'll just creep in on its own. So ask yourself, how would I know if it's true? How would I know if it's true? And your answer should be something like, well, if some vast number of, like if 90% of players make a specific decision at a specific point in gameplay and they all share this same context, sure, yeah, that's probably pretty true. Probably. So don't do things like, don't answer questions that are all about good, bad dichotomies, all about this relationship between like what's good and what isn't, because the second point is to be very aware of the tacit questions that you're answering. Because whenever you make a statement about your gameplay, take whatever statement you made earlier about the game, now ask another question about that statement. The question is, what question was it answering? Think of that statement as an answer to a question. What was the question? What question could possibly result in that answer, where the answer is whatever statement you made about the game earlier? That's really important, because a lot of times, well, pretty much exclusively, whenever anyone makes a statement about gameplay like that, you have a problem, because you have answered a question and you don't know what the question is a lot of the time. But good analysis should be all about understanding that question and then answering it and then moving forward with the process from there. Because if you just make a statement, you don't know what question you're asking. And if you don't know what question you're asking, then how could you possibly know how to apply that statement? So that's really important. Think about the questions that you're tacitly asking. The questions that have gone unsaid, that are implicit in that process. You've started the process with a statement because I told you to, but imagine you start a process on your own and you start with a statement. Well, first work backwards. What question does the statement answer? And is that a useful question to be asking? A good way to do analysis actually is to formulate a set of very specific and very concrete questions before you start. And if you are designing a game and you need help coming up with a solution to a problem, then your question is whatever design problem you're having, that becomes your question. Here's a game that does the thing that I want my game to do, but isn't doing. So what is the thing I want my game to do? What is the thing this game does? And how does it get that thing to happen? Now that was a pretty bad question because I said thing a lot, but you should have specific things and not say thing. So the third thing I want you to be thinking about when you're going into gameplay analysis is to make sure your answers to your question are clear and falsifiable. Both of those things are important. So a good example of a bad answer might be something like, well, this mechanic is boring. Why is the mechanic boring? Well, it's boring because it's a bad set of questions, right? Because if you say a thing is boring and then that raises the question, why is the mechanic boring? You're asking a question of why is it boring, which is not a good question because you're just going to get a bunch of, well, it's boring because I did this and I was bored. It's subjective. You're asking a subjective question. You need to be asking objective questions. If you ask objective questions, you'll get objective answers. A good example of that would be something like a majority of players have this behavior. Here's a specific behavior that I've outlined, that I've defined clearly. And then I put it in a context and placed it at a point in gameplay. And then I noticed across a lot of sample size that a large majority of players seems to be having that behavior. Now, if a large majority of players has that behavior at that point in the game, we can reasonably infer that probably the game is doing something that incentivizes that, or forces it, or something. The gameplay itself is somehow making that behavior exist. Probably, because so many people are doing it. So, then you can say, okay, here's how the gameplay makes that behavior unfold in play. Here's how it makes players want to do this thing or do this thing. That's a good answer, and it raises some interesting questions. So, an example of that might be, let's take the game Bloodborne. If you're not familiar with Bloodborne, that's okay. I specifically came up with an example that would mostly work whether or not you're familiar with the game. Now in the game there are these it's a vaguely horror themed game. And in the game there are these long strands of plants that come up from the ground and they end in this curl. Almost all plants in the game end in this curl. And the tree branches do the same thing, and the curl is at about the same spot at the end of the tree branches as it is at the end of the plants that come up out of the ground. And this is really interesting to me because the first thing I noticed was that happens, right? That there's this thing that happens. And I started asking myself, like, why might that be in the game? Like, why would, because it's nothing, that's not how, my first thought was, well, that's not how plants work. That seems dumb. But then I thought, if that's not how plants work, that means that they probably had some specific reason for changing the plants to work in this new way, because it's not how plants typically look. And then something interesting happened. I was playing the game, and I had a moment where I flicked the camera around to do something, and thought there was an enemy that I had left alive that was coming to kill me, and I very quickly turned around and got ready to fight it. And I realized that these plants, it was just the plants. Because the curls on the ends of the branches and the ends of the plants are right about the point where a head would be on like a humanoid. So it creates the scenario where you have, because you have control of the camera in the game, which means that doing really nicely framed like jump scares, it would be very, very difficult without locking the camera. And they don't want to lock the camera for a bunch of reasons that I'm not going to get into, but basically, they don't want you to lock the camera. So how do we get jump scares out if you can flip the camera, if we never know where the camera's going to be? Well, if we place these little things that look like enemies, we can make players sometimes think that there's enemies. So you can make the statement that these plants and the trees create a certain player behavior. Now, the beauty of this is that we are talking about the gameplay experience, but we're not talking about it from the perspective of, I was scared because. I'm talking about it from the experience of, well, here's a behavior that I had. And then in looking that up and looking at other people playing the game, I found that I wasn't the only one that happened to. So it was, I mean, I'm not going to say it was intentional, but that's part of the beauty of it, is it doesn't matter. Because the statement I made is valuable to me as a designer, because if I'm ever in a scenario where I want to create jump scares, but I don't have the normal tools that you would have to do that, which are things like very tightly controlled pacing, taking control of the camera from the player so that you can focus on a specific area, all of the things that you would generally have to put into making a jump scare. If you can't do a lot of that stuff, well, here's a solution that Bloodborne has. Here's a solution that I found in Bloodborne. Doesn't matter if the designers ever thought of that, ever. But also, the other thing to think about there is, I thought about it, so it's perfectly conceivable that another designer might have also had that thought at some point. Like, that's not weird to me at all. In fact, in all likelihood, they had the idea first, and then I just did the analysis to figure it out, and then that is what gave me the idea. But the thing is, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if they intended anything. So be very aware of how you're formulating your questions and your answers in a way that's useful to you. This plant example is a very useful design concept that I have in my head now. It's in my head forever. I can use it as I like. Isn't that great? And someone says, well, that clearly isn't intentional. I can say, probably is, but you know what? I don't care. I don't care. It can have been a complete accident, and I'm just the only person who's ever thought of that in the whole world, which seems extraordinarily unlikely to me. But sure, fine. It's still useful, right? And it's still only a value that I would have gotten out of gameplay analysis. One tiny example where there could be hundreds or thousands of examples like that go into your brain as you do more and more gameplay analysis. So that's the value of gameplay analysis and the mindset that you should go into gameplay analysis with in order to get that value out of gameplay analysis. So over the next couple of videos, we're going to be talking about what gameplay analysis actually is, what it looks like, and how to engage with it effectively, because it can actually be pretty difficult. An analysis is a skill, as I said, just like any other skill. So if you're not very good at it right away, don't worry. Nobody's good at anything the first time they pick it up, pretty much, as a general rule. You don't pick up a guitar and expect to be able to play it immediately. So just give it some time. You'll get better. And if you follow these processes that we're gonna cover in the next few videos, then you'll be practicing effectively, and that's important because you don't want to be building any really bad habits that are either useless or actively detrimental to your design process. And by making sure that you are going through these processes, then you will not develop bad habits. And if you do think these processes are going to make you develop bad habits, the beauty of it is that the process is laid out. It's laid out step by step. It's completely actionable. So if you think that the process is going to make you build bad habits, just identify exactly what part of the process is going to build exactly what habit, justify why you don't think you should have that habit, and then change that part of the process so that that doesn't occur. Simple. It's probably harder than it sounds, but theoretically, it's at least possible. And if you don't have processes at all, you don't even know what habits you're building. You could be building all kinds of terrible habits and not even know it. That is important to avoid. Okay, so in the next few videos, we're going to go through how to actually do this. The next video will be what not to do. That'll be a fun one. And I think in the meantime, I would just maybe just watch some gameplay, right? Once you finish this video, just go watch some gameplay and just think about the things that we've talked about here. We've just think about like how you can build a kind of observation out of that gameplay that functions as a relationship between gameplay experience, player actions and decisions, and mechanics. In the Bloodborne example, it wasn't strictly a mechanic, although the camera movement which you could call a mechanic, is definitely an important part of that whole process and that behavior and that experience. So there is a connection with the mechanics, and you could see how certain things being not allowed, if we said, well, we don't want the camera to ever be locked in a certain position, then we would need to find a solution for that. So you could definitely say that the mechanics are relevant in that relationship, definitely. So look at a game, just watch a game. Don't even worry about playing one yet. Just watch somebody else play a game and see what they do. Just identify their decisions, identify certain behaviors, and that's it. Just identify the behavior. Just identify the behavior. Then, once you've identified a behavior, ask yourself, what about the game causes that behavior? That's the question you want to ask. It doesn't matter if it was intentional. Nothing else matters. Just ask, why does that behavior occur as a result of a gameplay? That's the important thing. So that's that's the homework for this video. Go and do that. It should only take a few minutes, really. If you're struggling, just list behaviors. If you start to struggle, the first thing you need to do is just sit down, watch a gameplay video, and just go, player did this, player did this, player did this, and be specific. The player attacked this enemy. Well, which enemy? Was there an option? Why do you think there might not have been an option? There's a question you could ask. Why would the player not have an option of multiple enemies at this point in time? If there are more enemies, ask yourself, why are there so many enemies? Why would the player attack this enemy over another enemy? Those are all useful player experience questions. Very, very useful design analysis questions to ask. They might seem silly, but if you start digging into them, I think you'll see there's a lot there. It's not really complicated. It actually goes really deep. So just start with identifying behaviors if you get stuck. No problem. No problem at all. So that's the homework. And I wish you luck, and hopefully you'll get that taken care of. Hopefully it goes well for you. And I'll see you guys in video number 2.